For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson with the latest readout video from our Wednesday Wake Up email newsletter, to which you should subscribe, especially as it's free, though you should also make a monthly pledge to support our work, though it's not. And also with a hook 'em horns to viewers in Austin, Texas, which is number 29 on our all-time view list by city, and is also where I went to graduate school, which was a rather long time ago now, which makes it weird that when I arrived there in late August, before we had global heating, it was so hot I was literally buffeted by waves of heat rising off the sidewalk that I initially thought I'd made a hideous error in my choice of graduate school. It turned out I hadn't. And from those days, I also fondly recall my first car. On a lavish grad student income, I bought a used Toyota Starlet. No, really. It cost $1,900, and in 3 years, it never once failed to start. Unlike government policies across the Western world trying to force us to choose electric vehicles, that jalopy appears to be collapsing. Thus, headlines now warn us that, quote, Magna International cuts sales outlook as carmakers scale back EV plans, end quote. And even Heatmap deplores, quote, Ford's big blow to the EV transition, end quote, as Ford, the American car company, quote, has all but given up on making consumer electric vehicles, end quote. Unlike, say, Ford, the Ontario provincial premier, who, Dan McTeague of Canadians for Affordable Energy complains, is, quote, at it again with more taxpayer dollars for EVs, end quote, in company, so to speak, with his supposed partisan foe, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And it's not just EVs. Across the board, climate policy in the Western world has not delivered what it promised. Certainly, to hear the alarmists tell it, there has not been an improvement in the weather. Instead, we're in hell or some such place. And if you dig into their promises, it turns out that for the most part, they didn't think things were going to get better in terms of climate unless and until very drastic measures were implemented. But they assured us that these measures would bring about economic light and joy as a secondary effect long before they achieved their direct climate goals. And now that it's not happening, the situation is becoming ominously reality-based. For instance, 2 published reports done for Natural Resources Canada warned that, quote, the costs of this transition was a concern, end quote, to citizens. Yes, it really said that. And even publications like Vox are now fretting about, quote, the hidden reason why your power bill is so high, end quote, in the United States, where power bills are a lot lower than in Europe, but they are rising. So, all this pain for a microscopic emissions reduction that no model claims will reduce the temperature by any measurable amount? Or not even that? Bjorn Lomborg recently X'd out a piece from the International Journal of Sustainable Energy saying, in his words, and after a snide climate oops, that, quote, keeping nuclear in 2002 would have saved Germany €500 billion and today produced more CO2-free power than all renewables. Had Germany invested in more nuclear from 2002, emissions would be reduced 73% more and saved €300 billion, end quote. So, the policy was a total faceplant, from the shimmering Green New Deal vision of clean prosperity to the actual, GHG reductions. There's really no upside to this sort of arrogant debacle, including in PR terms. Hey there, just a quick reminder about subscriptions. We're this close to 100,000, so if you have already subscribed, thank you very much and enjoy the programs. If you haven't, click the button here, get us to 100,000 and beyond. And now, back to me. More generally, again via Lomborg, this time from Science, a study examined some, quote, 1,500 climate policies implemented between 1998 and 2022 across 41 countries from 6 continents, end quote, and found that only 63 of the policies had any significant impact, and even so, created a net reduction of only 0.15% in greenhouse gases. We're again of the view that a monkey throwing darts at a list of options would almost certainly have outperformed the greatest minds in climate policy if that's what they came up with. And speaking of minds, apparently it is all in the mind. Quote, Monica Gattinger, who directs the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science, Society and Policy, which conducts similar research, says when it comes to the issue of addressing climate change, Canadians are moving from the what to the how. What matters is how people view the issue, she said. When they see it as a citizen, they are ambitious, but when they look at it as a consumer, that's when questions rise of who pays for what, when, and how. At the end of the day, Gattinger says, what really matters is perception, end quote. No, what really matters is whether the policy is working. What matters is whether energy is expensive and unreliable. And when even the government report, putting as positive a spin on it for their paymasters as possible, feels obliged to include lines like, quote, lack of a clear path forward combined with aggressive targets were seen as a cause for concern by many, end quote, you know you're in trouble on the practicalities. Speaking of practicalities, Matthew Zeitlin at Heatmap strokes his lack of long gray beard and proclaims that, quote, it's getting harder to close a coal plant, end quote. And why? Well, it seems that, wonder of wonders, quote, fossil fuel plant requirements are slowing down and projected load growth is to blame, end quote. But we shouldn't be too sarcastic, since it actually is helpful that, however indirectly, he concedes that our lives depend on abundant power and that wind and solar can't provide it. Unlike the New York Times Climate Forward, seeking climate workers for American Samoa, as some former American service person, quote, realized that rising seas and worsening storms, fueled by climate change, had brought new problems to her homeland while exacerbating old ones, end quote. Yeah, problems like people thinking weather is a new problem, for instance, or endlessly mentioning worsening storms that no data show are happening. And another thing about climate alarmists, there's just no pleasing them. Bjorn Lomborg, yet again, highlights an item in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, of all places, about how, quote, desertification was supposed to be the greatest environmental challenge of our time. Why are experts now worried about greening, end quote? And then he grouses on X that, quote, campaigners used to tell us that desertification was the greatest environmental challenge of our time. They were wrong. CO2 is making the world greener almost everywhere, and of course, now greening is bad for deserts. You just can't make this up, end quote. Nor, we add, if you were sane, would you want to. Oh, and The Economist suddenly blurts out that, quote, basking in the sun has been considered a health hazard for at least 4 decades, end quote, because UV light, quote, can increase the chances of skin cancer, end quote, as well as making you wrinkly and old-looking. But now, quote, new research suggests it may be time to consider the benefits. Increased UV exposure appears to make people significantly less likely to die from cardiovascular disease as well as cancer, end quote. Egad, the government sanctimoniously botched the science, declared it settled, and ordered us all about like children? What next? Mask mandates? Forced EV purchases? But no, that would be silly. And to return to an item from last week, we'd like to mention that wind power is not new, as many assert. For instance, there was a piece in the Hill Times that attempted to calculate, quote, the amount of energy humanity must replace with new sources, e.g. wind, solar, end quote. But that's completely wrong. Don't they study history? Along with water mills, windmills were a key part of the medieval economic revolution that brought unprecedented prosperity and a cultural flourishing, including magnificent cathedrals and the invention of polyphonic music and the university, though some might now call that one a mixed blessing. And all of this prosperity, of course, was boosted by a beneficial warming, whose end in the 14th century brought famine and plague. Both kinds of mills, wind and water, replaced a great deal of inefficient drudgery by man and beast, because while the key purpose of both kinds of mills was grinding grain, an unbearable task if done by hand, yet essential on a huge scale if humans were going to eat, the power they produced was also adapted cleverly for purposes like fulling cloth, driving saws, and much more besides. But for all their marvelous efficiency in their day, there is a reason they were phased out in favor of what we now use, and it wasn't government mandates and subsidies. In the newsletter, we also note that the obsession with climate change extends all the way from continually imagining worse weather when statistically there's no sign of it, to finding ingenious ways to explain data trends that aren't happening. For instance, from Quanta magazine, we hear that, quote, physicists pinpoint the quantum origin of the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide's powerful heat-trapping effect has been traced to a quirk of its quantum structure. The finding may explain climate change better than any computer model, end quote. Which, frankly, wouldn't be much of an achievement, even if it were true. But in any case, it's not, because carbon dioxide does not have a powerful heat-trapping effect. The whole warming scare depends on the minor heat-trapping effect of carbon dioxide increasing the amount of water vapor in the air, which then does the heavy lifting when it comes to warming. Though the impact of both has almost certainly been overestimated, as our series on ECS in the real world last fall demonstrated. So, what these people are doing is explaining a non-thing with a trendy thing, conduct which we consider more ingenious than useful or praiseworthy. And then there's a piece in Yale Climate Connections that asks, quote, when will climate change turn life in the US upside down, end quote. When, not whether. While over at Euronews Green, it's, quote, society and the environment are suffering as climate change triples chances of extreme wildfires, end quote. As for Reuters' Sustainable Switch, it emails that, quote, extreme weather continues to plague nations around the world, end quote. And a Guardian fundraising email says, quote, in many parts of the world, this has been another summer of devastating extreme heat, having a catastrophic impact on the planet and all that lives on it, end quote. But actually, this summer hasn't been hot in many places, including much of the US, no matter how red they paint the map. To the point that AccuWeather recently wondered, quote, when might summer weather return to the northeastern US, end quote. But we seem to have moved from the realm of evidence-based decision-making into an alarmist nirvana where we are one with the panic on an elevated plane where the noise and annoyance of samsara can no longer reach us. Or, as The Guardian put it in another fundraiser, quote, at The Guardian, we believe the climate crisis poses a threat to all humanity and that the science is not up for debate, end quote. And if it were, we can't hear you, la 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 la. For our part, we start this week's installment in our Cheerful Charts series on death rates from climate disasters by citing Alec Epstein's point that fossil fuels didn't make a safe climate dangerous, they made a dangerous climate safe. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the data on climate-related deaths per million persons over the last 100 years, which shows that in direct contradiction to the endless hype about vast increases in lethally dangerous climate-driven storms, drought, crop failure, fires, floods, heat waves, and so on, the death rate from such things fell by 98%. There certainly aren't very many hazards and problems in this world that have declined by 98% in 100 years, let alone in the last 100. But the risk of dying from a climate-related disaster is one of them. And speaking of storms and data, we certainly concede that tornadoes can be frightening events, though not so frightening that there aren't some people who leap into their cars and chase them, hoping for some exciting video footage, which, frankly, we recommend that you consume online rather than producing in person at great risk. But we also insist that the weather systems responsible for tornadoes, called severe convective storms, are not getting more common. For instance, in the United States, there is no significant increase in such events, but on the southern Great Plains, also known as Tornado Alley, while the number of days with tornadoes has decreased, the number per day has increased, making it a wash overall. But the other key number is the value of damages from tornadoes. And according to a recent peer-reviewed study, once you normalize for population growth and the size of the economy, U.S. tornado losses over the 60 years from 1958 to 2018 significantly declined, as in went down. So there's more good news. Blast! If you're a climate alarmist. Finally, so we don't ring in autumn too soon with our talk of apples and farmers markets last week, we note from the CO2science.org archive that the late summer fruit Prunus armeniaca L, which sounds better if we say apricots, also grows a lot better with more CO2, so keep it coming. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and I have no fond memories of any electric vehicle, and I don't plan to acquire any.